Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hello, True Drews, and welcome to another episode of the podcast, and I hope you all had a good Valentine's Day yesterday. We don't really celebrate it. Me and my husband, we will kind of sometimes just go out to eat or hang out, but it's really not like a huge holiday for us. It's been kind of cold around here, though, and I've kind of been wanting us to get a good snow. I feel like it's not winter unless we get at least one good snow. My idea of the perfect snow day would be that I'm off. I don't have to work, so I don't have to drive in it, but just sitting around at home, reading a Nancy Drew book, and drinking some hot chocolate. So, I don't know. Maybe we'll get a snow. Maybe we won't. We'll see. Now, as for the Nancy Drew book that we're going to be discussing in today's episode, it is The Clue of the Tapping Heels, and this is the 16th book in the Nancy Drew series, and it was written in 1939. So, we're getting closer to the 40s. So we're going to see some different stuff in some of the books coming up. So we're going to jump right in and discuss some of these book covers, and there are actually 3, and I've already posted them on my Instagram, which is True Drew Podcast. I always post these on Wednesdays, the day before the podcast airs, so you all can kind of know the imagery that we're talking about. But the first edition of this cover shows Nancy, Bess, and George, and they are holding this ladder up against the side of this house. And the house is Miss Carter's house, and she is the woman that has all of the Persian cats in this story. And we can kind of tell from this ladder in the open window, someone has obviously broken into the house this way, and there is a pine tree behind the girls and a full moon. Oh, and there's a figure in a red shirt in the corner back behind that pine tree, kind of sneaking away. So I'm assuming this is either the neighbor, who is Mr. Bunce, I think is his name, or it's Gus Woonton. Now, the second edition of this cover is fairly similar, except it's only Nancy, and she's kind of standing closer in the foreground, and she's looking at this ladder in the open window, and we can again see the figure of that sneaking man who's sneaking away from the house. And the third and final cover for The Clue of the Tapping Heels, this is the one that I knew from childhood, and it used to scare me. It just looked like such a freaky cover. I've talked about this on Instagram a couple times previous to this episode airing, and there is a Persian cat. It's just this floating cat head, and he's got these orange, really evil looking eyes. And then there's Nancy's full silhouette. She's wearing, it almost looks like a sailor uniform. It's just white pants and a white shirt, and she's got these pink tap shoes on. And then, again, we have Nancy's disembodied head because, it wouldn't be a flashlight edition from the 60s or 70s without that. And it just, I don't know, something about the cat's eyes always scared me as a kid. So I came up with a couple different cover spoofs, and for the earliest cover, I said, now this is how you break into a house, because it kind of looks like Nancy, George, and Bess are kind of having this discussion on the lawn about how to get up to that window. And for the revised cover, I came up with the spoof of The Clue of the Haunted Hair in the Shower Drain, because honestly, this cat looks possessed and its hair is sticking out every which way, and it looks a little bit scary. But I gave these covers the rating of 2 magnifying glasses. They're good, and it's not because I'm terrorized by this cover by any means. It's just that I don't know. They're not my favorite. I think there's more action-packed book covers for Nancy Drew books out there. I've worked through my fears, and I'm no longer scared of this book cover. It's just a little eerie looking. That's all I'm saying. Now, as for the characters in this book, we have Bess and George helping Nancy solve this mystery again, which has become pretty standard since book 5. And we have Miss Beeling, who is a nurse to Mrs. Carter, and Miss Carter is the one who owns all these Persian cats. And she has a man who was almost her fiance. His name is Toby Simpson. And Mr. Bunce, I believe is how you say the neighbor's name. And Gus Woonton, who is a man, or he was a child at the time, but used to live in the house that Miss Carter now owns. So I came up with a synopsis because there's a lot going on in this book. A friend of Hannah Gruen's, Miss Beeling, wants Nancy to solve the mystery of some tapping noises at her patient, Miss Carter's house. It's coming from the walls and not the many Persian cats the woman owns. Nancy, Bess, and George go to stay with the woman, and the first night, Nancy hears the tapping, and Bess and George are scared by someone breaking into the garage. Nancy is tailed in her car by a quote-unquote pudgy man who later comes to her play rehearsal and punches Ned. Back at Miss Carter's house, Nancy finds a secret room someone has been living in and insists the woman changes her locks. She also begins to think the tapping may be Morse code. Nancy finds a diary in the secret room belonging to a Gus Woonton. When Nancy goes to her play rehearsal a second time, someone sets an intentional fire and locks her and Ned under the stage. Nancy, Bess, and George also learn that 5 Persian cats have been stolen. When they go to a cat show to sell some of Miss Carter's remaining Persians, they find a shifty man doing the same for much cheaper and suspect they're the stolen cats. Nancy also has to chase a cat into the rafters and rescue it. Nancy is almost crushed by a wall of stage dressing during her rehearsal, and the descriptions of the man who pushed it match Gus Woonton. They also find the neighbor, Mr. Bunce, unconscious on the driveway and allegedly hit over the head. Carson also does some digging and finds out that Gus Woonton's parents are dead, and someone named W.F. Bunce is Gus's executor of estate. But before Nancy can investigate this, the Bunces mysteriously move out. Next, Nancy almost has her car blown up by a bomb placed under it. Nancy and Ned are able to finally catch Gus Woonton, who was searching for his parents and jewels and valuables he'd hidden over the years. He goes to jail, then Nancy remembers the trap door he came out of was left open. When she goes to shut it, Bunce and his friend, coincidentally the catnapper, shove her into the secret passageway. Nancy's friends call the police, who have apprehended the crooks. Nancy is rescued, and this mystery is solved. So, there's quite a bit going on in this book. But the newspaper headline synopsis that I came up with for this book is Cat Burglar Apprehended by Teen Detective. So I took down a lot of notes for this one because this was a very entertaining book to read. I don't know, I was looking at the cover and I was like, I think I remember this being a pretty good book, but you never know. Sometimes the covers don't really matter. Sometimes the best covers are on the worst books and vice versa. But this was a very entertaining read. So the first note that I took down has to do with the Drews' house. I've been taking down notes, and so far we know that the Drews have a 3-story house, and they have a modern pink and white kitchen, and now we know that the Drews have a basement recreation room, and that's where Nancy, I guess, does her tap dancing and just whatever else she wants to do. All her numerous skills that she has. So my next thing that I wrote down is just a quote from Hannah, and it just says, "Cats are cats." Because I think Bess is talking about how to care for these Persian cats. She's like, are they different from other cats? And Hannah's just like, cats are cats. And I felt that. Sorry if I've got any people listening who are cat people. I actually love cats. I actually pet sit full time for a living, but I have a pet rabbit, so I'm a bit of a rabbit person myself. Now, my next note says, Bess and George have to ask their parents for permission to help on the case. And I said, I wonder how that went. Yeah, there's these weird tapping noises in the walls at this cat lady's house. Can I go? And I mean, like, Bess and George go along on a lot of Nancy's adventures. But, now that I'm thinking about it, for The Secret of Redgate Farm, like, the Fanes and the Marvins were perfectly fine with letting their daughters go off to this, supposed cult. I mean, cats should be no problem. Okay, so the next thing that I wrote down, Nancy found this little kitten that was drugged. It kind of ran out in front of her car as she was pulling up to Miss Carter's house. And I was like, that made me sad. So somebody was kidnapping the cats, and to make them more agreeable, they were drugging them. I guess putting them kind of in this light, state of sleep. But it's pretty messed up. So the next thing I wrote down was a cattery. Apparently, so Miss Carter keeps her cats in the garage with a bunch of hay, and Bess and George literally go out there and take a quote-unquote cat nap with the cats in the garage. and they try to nab this cat burglar that keeps, coming and stealing the cats. But I thought it was hilarious because when it came time to see who was going to sleep in the garage, Nancy was like, no, I'm good, thanks. And she just slept inside. She made Bess and George go out there. Okay, so I know this is a real name. I'm assuming. I've never met anybody with this last name, but I about spit my water out when I was reading this. So Nancy is tap dancing and she's in this play, and the director's name is Mr. Skank. And I just thought, oh gosh, that's so unfortunate. That's about like that guy in Clue the Broken Locket who was Enos Crinkle. I was just like, oh gosh, I wouldn't want to have Skank as a last name. Oh yeah, and so while we're on the subject of Nancy's tap dancing, she's learning to tap dance in Morse code in the first couple pages of this book, and I was like, what does that sound like? Just, I don't know. I mean, just, it seems like a pretty useless skill, but I don't know. It might come in handy if you're tied up and you have to tap to someone like, hey, let me out. I just couldn't stop cracking up laughing when I was thinking of Nancy being like, hey, I'm Nancy Drew. I like to solve mysteries, or just whatever it is she's tapping out. So the next note that I have is the guy who tailed Nancy comes to her play rehearsal and punches Ned in the face. And so we're pretty sure it was Gus Woonton, but Gus Woonton, his only descriptor throughout the whole book is that he's pudgy. And I don't know. I was just like, okay. The things that they use to describe the villains is always so interesting to me. They'll be like, he had a hooked nose, or a moon-shaped scar on his cheek, or he's pudgy. I don't know. It's interesting. But Nancy discovers a hidden room in the house that Miss Carter, her house, and someone has been staying there. And I just wrote, ick. Then to make it worse, there's a diary in there from some boy who was kept in there and told he was crazy. So I was like, oh, here we go. Mental health stigmas from, the 1950s or 60s or whenever this was revised. Also, that boy is Gus Woonton. He is the one that used to live in that house with his parents, and they apparently put him down there because he was prone to run away. And I was like, does that really, make you mentally unstable, though? I'm pretty sure everyone at some point's like, I'm gonna run away. Do they really do it? Maybe not, but I don't know. I thought that was a bit of a stretch. But there is a funny excerpt from Gus's diary, and one of the entries says, August 28th, we're still at the Grand Hotel, and everybody in it bores me. This morning, I sneaked off before breakfast and helped myself to a motorboat, and then he stole someone's wallet, apparently. But he just goes on this little joyride, so I'm like, okay, maybe he's a little bit of a klepto, and he takes things, but I don't know. The next thing that I wrote down is Nancy asks, how many miles is it to South Bedford for the cat show? And I don't know, but I've always just asked how many minutes away somewhere is, and I thought that was interesting. So, I mean, you could probably figure that out with some basic math, but I was like, I hate math. So, okay, another part that made me laugh. So the girls get to the cat show, Nancy, Bess, and George, and they put a sign up next to the Persians that they're trying to sell for Miss Carter, and they wrote down lovable, companionable, I can't talk, and decorative. And I said, what are they? Futons? They're cats. They're decorative. Who says that they have a decorative pet? Oh yeah. My rabbit Reese, I wouldn't go and tell people yeah, I have a decorative rabbit. It just sounds weird. No, she's a lovable and cute companion. She's not decorative. So, as you can guess, at the cat show, everything just hits the fan, and Nancy has to chase a cat named Abatha. Abatha with a B, not Agatha. And it just reminded me of that scene in Mean Girls where the principal is like, I'm almost as mad about the fact that my sister named my nephew Afrony instead of Anthony. I was like, what kind of a name is Abatha? But anyway, Abatha gets into the rafters at the cat show, and Nancy has to nab her with a net. I mean, I don't know how many feet that is off the ground, but in the book, it looks like Nancy is up in the rafters of a gym. It looks pretty high up. And then when Nancy finally gets Abatha out of the rafters, George, starts talking the cat up, and she's like, can I get $10? Can I get this much? And she's bidding them up and having an auction, yeah, for this cat. And so all these people are like, I like a feisty cat. I like a cat that gets up in the rafters and runs away from you. So everybody's like having a bidding war over Abatha. And I don't know, she sells for like 3 times her price is what Nancy says. Oh, it was funny. And let's see. So Nancy almost gets crushed by a wall at her play. Someone tries to push this set dressing over on top of her. And then George gets a mousetrap on her finger in the secret room at Miss Carter's house. And they determine that Gus Winton probably put it there because he, didn't want anyone to find how he was getting in and out of the house. Now, I think I mentioned it in one of the last episodes, The Haunted Bridge. There was this whole subplot with these 2 characters where they were engaged and then they got separated. And I was talking about how it was so weird. Well, in this book, there's also an entire subplot where Miss Carter was engaged to this guy, Toby Simpson, who was an actor friend of hers, and they were in this play together. And she just says they became separated through odd circumstances. And I said, gosh, what did people do without social media? And I said, also, it sounds a little like he ran out on you. And I don't know, maybe he was just like, I don't want to marry a cat lady. Who knows? But I'm like, if you loved each other, I think you'd find a way. The next note that I wrote down, I said there's a lot about mental health in this book, and Gus Winton was locked in a room by his parents, kind of, I guess, like a disappointment room for bad behavior, and Nancy thinks at one point that she feels sorry for him, and she wonders if he'd had more help as a child, maybe he wouldn't have turned out this way and turned to a life of crime. And I thought that was refreshingly detached, yet respectable. It wasn't super stigmatizing, which is what I thought might be in this book. There was also a very creepy part in this book where Nancy knows that somebody's in the walls because they're making these tapping noises, and it's Gus, and he's trying to find these jewels that belong to his parents that he hid in different places. And the quote that I wrote down was, "An eerie feeling came over Nancy as if she were being watched by unseen eyes." Ugh, I hate that. Now, you might remember from the brief mentioning in the synopsis, but there was a bomb put under Nancy's car by Mr. Bunce, is who we found out does it later. But Carson, runs out there, and Nancy is so afraid for him, and he turns it over, and it kind of disarms it, apparently, or slows it down. And he says he took a class on how to deactivate bombs because he thought it might come in handy. And I said, what? I said, are you planning on hanging around terrorists, Carson? And also, Tommy heard the ticking, so he saved the day, and he's forgiven for riding that elephant back in The Mystery of the Ivory Charm. Tommy is just this little neighborhood boy that sometimes comes up and knocks on the Drew's door sometimes. So, now, there's also a point in the book where Dave, Bert, and Ned come along to help, and Dave is apparently a dog guy. He's less than enthusiastic about the cats. I took a note of that. And Ned and Bert think the person breaking into Miss Carter's house was wearing spiked shoes and gloves to scale the house, which in their defense, that is what is happening. They are scaling, it's Gus Winton, and he's scaling the house. He's definitely not playing golf in these golf shoes with these spikes on them, but I was like, wow, that's interesting. I'm just trying to picture this man climbing the side of this house like Spider-Man. I mean, it seems kind of funny that they even put the ladder in the cover art, but, whatever. So, towards the end of the book, Nancy is able to talk to Gus Winton when they finally catch him in the attic, and he does know Morse code, so he was tapping back to her, and she was tapping codes to him. And apparently, though, there was tapping at other points in the book, and Nancy would go and look, and nobody was there. And apparently some of that tapping was from Mrs. Carter herself. So Miss Carter is apparently paralyzed. There are several instances in the book where she has to be carried up and down the stairs, but she likes to relive her tap dancing days by putting the shoes on her hands and tapping on her bed frame. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's so sad. But Nancy has a good laugh over that. She's like, and Miss Carter was like, I didn't realize anybody could hear me. So at the end of the mystery, when it's solved, we, of course, get to see Nancy go to her play, and she does her little tap dancing number. And in the middle of the play, or towards the end, she taps out. If anybody can translate this, let me know if you have another mystery for me. I'm just like, did her and the director, Mr. Skank, just agree on this? Nancy's like, hey, I need another mystery because I solved this one, so can I like work this into the play or something? But this man like stands up in the back of the room at the theater and says he has a mystery for her. He's like, I do, the mystery of the brass-bound trunk, which I was like, oh, okay then. Well, this man knows Morse code apparently, and he's apparently given a name to this mystery that he has, like the mystery of the brass-bound trunk. That would be like me naming like the mystery of the missing sock. I will go ahead and tell you now because the mystery of the brass-bound trunk is the very next in the series, and I've already read it up to the point of this episode airing, and there's no tie-in with this at all. Like, they make this big deal of doing this at the end of the Clue of the Tapping Heels, like, I've got a mystery for you, and then the next book, I thought it was going to tie in, but no, Nancy literally gets on a boat, and then she finds a mystery. So kind of a missed opportunity, guys. But last week's episode, we didn't have many instances of Hannah Gruen doing any cooking, but this time we did. So for What's Cooking with Hannah Gruen, I took some notes on some of the dishes she prepared. So Hannah apparently cooked roast lamb, peas, and raspberry tarts, and then at another point in the book, she kind of made the same thing but with strawberry shortcake instead. Hannah also made some steak, and a tomato and cucumber salad and lemon meringue pie. And then another instance, she made coffee cake. And then when Nancy and the boys went to Mrs. Carter's, she loaded them down with some chicken sandwiches, sliced tomatoes, and apple pie with ice cream. I've noticed a trend, and this could be just from the revisions, but the further we get away from the Great Depression, just the better the food sounds in general. Now, for the skills that Nancy can add to her resume, not surprisingly, a lot of them have to do with cats. So I wrote down that Nancy is a cat sitter and a cat wrangler because she has to go up in the rafters and nab Abatha with this net. And then, of course, the most impressive skill, as far as I'm concerned, is the Morse code tap dancing. Like, it's such a weird skill to have, but it sounds pretty cool. Now, I wrote down some things that I liked about the Clue of the Tapping Heels and some things that I didn't like. Honestly, I loved all the crazy cat antics. I mean, it wasn't nice that the villains, the cat nabbers, drugged the cats, but I thought the cats in general, they were just pretty entertaining. I also loved all of the Drew crew teamwork between Nancy, Bess, George, Bert, Ned, and Dave. I just always think it's really cool when all of them come in and kind of they all help and support Nancy when she's solving these mysteries. And there were secret passageways and secret rooms and Morse code and tap dancing. Like, all of that was really cool. Now, the thing that I didn't like about this book is really kind of a minor thing, but the whole subplot of Toby Simpson and Miss Carter. I don't know why sometimes. I don't know if it's Harriet's doing. I guess it's Harriet's doing. They just throw in these random, like, love plots that have nothing to do with the mystery. And I said, I have so many questions about Toby Simpson and Miss Carter. Like, how did they lose touch? Did he just not want to marry her? Did she not want to marry a fool because that's what he played in the play they were in? It was like The Lover and the Fool or something. But I don't know. I didn't think any of that was necessary. But really, that's my only gripe with this book. Although it was outrageous at points, it was very fun to read, so I gave it a rating of 4 magnifying glasses. This is up from several of the ones that we've read lately. I thought that it was a pretty good plot. It was entertaining. There were some interesting twists thrown in there, and minus the subplot that I didn't like, it was a pretty good book. So for next week's episode, we're going to be talking about the mystery of the brass-bound trunk, and we're getting so close to getting into the 20s of the books. I think this next one is number 17. So yeah, that's pretty cool. And we are getting further along in this podcast. So I just want to say thank you for listening to all these episodes, and I love talking about these books from my childhood with you all, and I love laughing about them because it's just fun. So thank you for listening, and if you are listening on Apple or Spotify or wherever you're listening, if you could leave me a review, I would really appreciate that. I love hearing from you guys, and if you want to follow along with my Nancy Drew antics, I'm over on Instagram at True Drew Podcast. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. If you'd like to stay up to date on the latest information and new episodes, our Instagram is True Drew Podcast. Or for general inquiries, you can email us at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com.